Like I was saying, this is a course about modern Europe. Now, we could spend a lot of time debating about what the word modern means, and in fact, the first half of my course will be offering my argument. As it turns out, Europeans spend a lot more time debating what Europe means. For example, in the summer of 2004, the website of the European Union asserted that, quote, Turkey lies on the very edge of the European continent, and the prospect of its joining the EU raises questions about where to draw the ultimate boundaries of the European Union. In other words, they don't even know. So, for the purposes of our course, Europe means the continent west of Asia, from the Ural Mountains in the east to Cabo de Roca, Portugal, in the west, but also including the Atlantic islands to Iceland. From Cap Nordkun, Norway in the north, to Gibraltar, Sicily, Greece, and maybe, as we need it, Turkey in the south. That's about 4 million square miles. By the way, unless you won your geography bee in school, you might want to have a map of Europe handy for this particular lecture. Now, depending upon the period covered, that comprises about 35 countries. If this is a problem for the EU, it's one for the history professor as well, especially the teacher of Western civilization. This course will tell a story about Europe, in particular, its rise to modernity. But it will not tell every story about Europe, nor the story of every part of Europe. Rather, we're going to be concentrating on those parts of Europe that tended to change most rapidly and dramatically from their medieval origins, politically, economically, and intellectually, and which thus had the greatest influence over our own American civilization. In other words, we're going to be concentrating mainly on Western Europe. Towards the beginning of the course, we will spend a disproportionate amount of time on Italy, Spain, France, and the British Isles, in part because these countries are most associated with those developments that launched the modern world: the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific and rational revolutions. But also in part because these were the countries facing west, and so had the most to do with, well, what became us. By the way, the Americas, Africa, Asia, Oceania will enter into our story often, for they have affected and been affected by Europe profoundly. Later, we'll add Germany, Italy again, and finally Russia. So even as a matter of how this course is organized, geography is destiny. What that means is that this course may be disappointing to those of you wishing detailed information about any one particular country, particularly if that country does not have a history of pushing its neighbors around or being pushed, or of aggressively pursuing intellectual or economic dominance. So my apologies to partisans of the Baltic states or Scandinavia, Luxembourg, Andorra, or Monaco, even the Balkans for much of the first half of this course. These places will enter into the course as they affect the larger story. Ironically, they are least likely to do so when they behave or are left in peace. Let's begin with some basic geography. One easy way to approach the geography and even the politics of Europe is to think in terms of great axial divides, east versus west, north versus south. I want to stress that these are states of mind and cultural categories as much as they are geographic regions. For example, the east-west border in our course is going to shift. For the first half, Western Europe will comprise everything west of the Rhine: the British Isles, Spain and Portugal, France, the Scandinavian countries, and I know that this is geographically incorrect, Italy. Eastern Europe will include countless German states, Poland, the Baltic states, the Balkans, and Russia. But as the course progresses, sometime in the 19th century, that east-west dividing line is going to shift east to the Elbe or the Oder rivers. In other words, as the region known as Germany, it didn't unify as a country until 1871, industrializes and becomes a cultural leader, looking to the industrializing West instead of the still feudal East, it will shift. It will become a Western country. This is a sign that geographical designations are constructs. They're based as much on culture as they are on physical topography. Now, it's possible that we're witnessing a similar shift west today among former communist nations and Turkey, that process of joining the EU. If the dividing line east-west is as much political, economic, and cultural as it is topographic, this is equally true for Europe's north-south divide, the Alps. North of the Alps, it's colder, and agriculture involves heavy grains, and people excel at, well, indoor activities. South of the Alps, it tends to be warmer. They grow citrus and olive oil and wine, and people can spend more time outdoors. But Southern Europe is also culturally different because its location provided lots more contact with Africa and Islamic civilizations of the Middle East. Other natural features have had a profound effect on European history. Mountains have been important as barriers to invasion and trade. The Pyrenees separate France and Spain crucially in the 17th century and will do so again during the 1930s and the 1940s. In Britain, the Pennines and the mountainous regions of Wales and Scotland help to explain why those two countries are actually culturally and ethnically different from England. When the Anglo-Saxons came over, they didn't get there. Forests also act, or at least they didn't get there for several centuries. Forests also act as barriers. The Ardennes and the Argonne on the French and German border will figure especially in the Franco-Prussian War and World Wars I and II. Less dramatically, because they are isolated, because forests are isolated and not conducive to arable farming, forests will develop their own unique economies. People will live in small settlements. Sometimes those settlements will be mobile. They'll engage in pastoral, sheep farming, not arable farming, and they'll do a lot of hunting. Now that's a problem, because forests in many European countries were owned by the king and set aside for his own hunting. Therefore, to hunt was to poach, and to be a hunter was to be an outlaw. So forest people, like gypsies, will be considered outsiders, almost a counterculture for most of our course. People who got their livings at sea were also outside the mainstream. Fishermen, merchants, pirates. That reminds us that water defines much of Europe. So to get back to geography, or the physical aspect of geography. First, Europe is a peninsula. In fact, it's a peninsula filled with other peninsulas. This implies that it is surrounded on 3 parts by water, and that it has lots of natural harbors, which of course are conducive to seafaring and trade. In terms of islands, there's one great group and numerous smaller islands. The great group of islands is, of course, the British Isles. Now, legend has it that the fact that Great Britain and Ireland are a series of islands has prevented invasion and preserved the unique cultures of these places. It's certainly true that in 1588, the Spanish Armada, in 1805, Napoleon, and in 1940, Hitler were all thwarted in their plans to invade Great Britain because of the English Channel. The failure of those invasions was crucial, for it enabled a very important subset of Western values to survive, even when the rest of the continent seemed to go the other way. But I always like to remind my students that more often the English Channel has been a highway for both invaders and traders. There have been lots of successful invasions of Great Britain. The one everybody knows about is 1066. One we're going to talk about took place as recently as 1688, when the Dutch, under William III, invaded. This has led to a never-ending debate in Britain about the degree to which Britain is part of Europe. The British can very easily now cross the Channel or cross under the Channel to join their continental brethren. Iceland will be an important stopping point on the way to America. Mediterranean islands will be strategic for trade and for naval operations. Malta and Crete will be important naval bases, especially during the World Wars. And then, of course, there's Gibraltar, the famous gateway to the Mediterranean. Won by Great Britain from Spain during the War of the Spanish Succession at the beginning of the 18th century, the fact that the Union flag still flies over Gibraltar is a real sore point to Spain and subject to periodic negotiations today. But perhaps the liquid feature of geography that matters most in European history would be rivers. European diplomats and historians have tended to see rivers as barriers. The Rhine, the Elbe, the Rubicon, the Danube. Crossing the Rubicon is, of course, an important phrase in our culture. But peoples on the move have tended to see them as highways, as a means for early settlers to penetrate the countryside. The Germanic tribes penetrated into the Roman Empire along the Danube, the Celts and Anglo-Saxons into England on the Thames, and of course the Vikings used the Rhine to get into the heart of Europe. Later, during our period, certainly, important for trade. The Tiber, the Rhine, the Thames, the Seine have all been crucial to the economies of their respective countries. Plains are crucial for agriculture. There are three great plains in Europe to know about: the Eastern Plain that stretches from East Germany through Poland to Russia, Eastern France, and the Midland Plain in England, which altogether form Europe's breadbasket. Plains, by the way, are also very useful highways for invaders, as, for example, Napoleon's and the German armies would prove during the Napoleonic Wars and World War II. Let us now turn to climate. Speaking latitudinally, Europe should be a lot colder than it is. London sits at the same latitude as Hudson's Bay. Northern Spain, the same as Chicago. Now, Northern Europe is famously cold: Scandinavia, North Germany, Russia. But Western Europe is warmed by the Gulf Stream, and so Western Europe experiences a relatively mild climate. The weather in England is always famously never very good, but it's also never very bad, never very cold, never very warm, and so very good for growing heavy grains. Southern Europe, warmed by the Mediterranean, is of course good for citrus, olive oil, and winemaking. I'd now like to talk about the demography of Europe, the population, the people that make up this place and culture. If we were to take a field trip to early modern Europe, Europe in 1500, the first thing we would notice is the relative lack of people, especially as compared to today. Now, I should perhaps explain that because this course is about the rise of modern Western civilization, and because I believe that modernity was beginning well before 1700 or 1600, I'm going to choose as my baseline year here 1500. In 1500, the population of Europe was maybe 80 million. Today, it's more like 726 million. Now, that implies tremendous growth, but of course, that growth was slower than any other continent in the history of the planet during that time. And in fact, the population of Europe is now in decline. Even during the Middle Ages, the population of Europe had actually once been much larger. But in 1347 to 50, the Black Death, named for the black patches it left on the skin, and probably bubonic plague, though historians still argue about this, had swept into Europe, killing anywhere from 2/5 to 1/2 of the population. What has that got to do with 1500? Well, that population continued to dwindle for a century, and then only slowly began to grow back, beginning around 1450, 1500. There are many things to hold back the population of Europe as this course begins. Periodic recurrences of the plague happened between 1361 and 1722, the last outbreak in Marseille, France. There was a host of additional bacterial and viral infections and exotic epidemic diseases to which Europeans were prone. Remember that late medieval and early modern people had no understanding of the connections among hygiene, germs, and disease. In fact, we oftentimes don't actually know what diseases attacked them. They had weird names like the sweating sickness or the bloody flux. They had no recourse to modern antibiotics. As a result, this period has been called the Golden Age of bacteria. Famine was also something that Europeans had to deal with, usually as a result of bad harvests. About 1 out of 4 harvests was bad, 1 out of 6 so bad as to induce famine. While few people actually starved, the scarcity of food lowered resistance to disease, and that sent death rates up. Clothing and housing were barely adequate to keep one warm and dry. Most people had one flea-infested suit of woolen clothes and linen underwear, which was the only part of their clothing that they washed regularly. They lived in flimsy huts made of mud and straw, as we'll see towards the end of this lecture. They were subject to accidents, fire, drowning. Nobody knew how to swim. Were very common. Violence was also common in the early modern period, war and assault, as we will see. As a result, the average life expectancy in Europe in 1500 was about 30 years. The young were not spared. Infant mortality ran at about 20% in the first year. This included 5% of babies which were stillborn, and another 10% of children who would die by the age of 10. This has led some historians to postulate that parents avoided emotional investment in their children, but that is a very controversial concept among historians. What is certain is that this population only began to recover again after 1500. The demographic disaster of the 14th and 15th centuries had tremendous economic consequences. Ironically, the golden age of bacteria was also a golden age for labor. You see, if you managed to survive the Black Death, that meant you were part of a very small labor force that was very much in demand. These people who were left could demand an end to serfdom, they could demand to be paid in wages, they could demand lower food prices and lower rents. That was good news for agricultural workers, terrible news for landowners, who had to find other ways of raising money. So what they did was they sometimes abandoned farming themselves. They would rent to peasants instead and let them farm the land. Sometimes they'd throw the peasants off their land in a process called enclosure and revert to sheep farming. This was a process that was much criticized at the time. If you've ever read More's Utopia, you know this. Finally, some aristocrats sought economic gain through war and plunder. The period before 1500 sees a rash of wars fought among kings and aristocrats. The 100 Years' War between France and England, 1337 to 1456. The Wars of the Roses in England, 1455 to 1485. And numerous smaller campaigns in Poland, Prussia, infighting among Italian cities, dynastic and religious wars in Spain. Where did people live? Well, less than 5% lived of them in towns. The largest city in Europe in 1500 was Constantinople, but that had only 400,000 people. Only a few other cities approached the size of, say, Birmingham, Alabama, or Stockton, California today. Paris had 200,000, Naples 150,000, Venice 100,000. Then there's a clutch of smaller cities at about 50,000, London, Amsterdam, Moscow, Lisbon, Madrid, Rome, and Florence. Note the high number of these that are Italian. We'll come back to that. Below that level of town, cathedral, county, and market towns might house several hundred. I refer to places like Salisbury in England or Rheims in France, Bruges or Dortmund or Lyon. Some of these towns were not very urban, just a couple of cross streets surrounded by fields with a market square. They would often swell during holiday periods or during markets to twice their normal size. All depended on trade, and that meant they were vulnerable to war and epidemic. In any case, most people didn't live in towns. The vast majority of Europeans lived in villages of less than 500 inhabitants, sometimes as few as 50. Let us imagine that in our quest to find the people of Europe at the beginning of our course, we've trekked across forest and field looking for human habitation. We would find the continent mostly empty and green, but perhaps in the distance we'd spy the towers of a castle or a windmill, or most likely the steeple of a village church. Any of these would tell us that we had stumbled upon the estate of a great landlord known as a manor. Now, there are probably two impressive buildings on this manor. The first would be the Lord's Manor House. It might be near the center of the village or up on a hill. Actually, if this lord has lots of manors, his manor house might be on another manor. It might be an impressive castle or a big timber frame house. But the building that draws our attention rather more magnetically, I think, is the church. The church was virtually the only stone building in town apart from that manor house. It was the religious center of the village where Sunday services were held and holy days, about 40 of them were celebrated, and all the important rites of passage of one's life, one's birth in baptism, one's marriage in matrimony, and one's death at one's funeral. This church has no competition. There's one church per village. In most of Europe, there's only one legal religion. In the West, before about 1550, what we today call Roman Catholicism. In the East, one of the Christian Orthodox faiths. So on Sundays, holy days, funerals, the entire village turns up to hear the Latin or Greek Mass performed behind an altar screen and to hear a homily in the vernacular. Now that homily is probably the only religious instruction and the only news that these people get. And I want to make 3 points about it. First, most people were probably illiterate, about 95% of the population. There were no newspapers, no television, no radio, no internet. The local priest is almost certainly selected and remains employed by the landlord. In other words, he's giving you the news, but he's giving you the news the landlord wants you to have. He's giving you the company line. Now, after Mass, there's likely to be some sort of party, some sort of socializing, because Sunday and holy days are the only days these people have off from working in the fields. There might be a church ale or the feast associated with a particular saint. On Sundays and holidays, people would engage in football and stickball. They would drink ale while sitting on the tombstones surrounding the village church. A couple of points to make here. One is that the entire village is present, even past generations, because given the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, there's a sense in which the living villagers are still praying for the people over whose graves they're drinking the ale and playing the football. The second point to make is that obviously the church is the social as well as the religious center of the village. And contemporaries would actually have been shocked at the way we draw a line between those two things. After the excitement of the day, we might accompany the villagers down their one dirt track to their homes. These were likely to be small two-room huts or shacks. They're made of, well, basically anything that will stick together: mud, straw, animal manure. As a result, they're pretty flimsy and they're easily destroyed, washed away anytime it rains. More prosperous peasants might, at this stage, be able to afford a small house of stone or wood. All of these houses had thatched roofs and dirt floors. There might be one wooden door, but few or no windows, because windows let in the cold. On entering one of these hovels, our eyes take some time to adjust to the darkness because of the lack of light and the smoke. When our eyes do adjust, we would see a hearth in the center. Now, please don't think of a cheery brick fireplace. Rather, I want you to imagine an indoor campfire. This was the family's main source of light, of heat, its main implement for cooking. When the harvests were good, the average peasant's diet was pretty well balanced, if not particularly mouth-watering. Rough brown bread, pea soup, cheese, meat on very rare occasions, ale, or wine. Looking around the room, we might spy some possessions: a few pots and pans, a table and some stools, a chest, a candle holder, some candles, a few articles of clothing. People slept on rushes or mattresses that were stuffed with straw. Admittedly, they spent most of their time working outdoors, but at night and in the winter they lived their entire lives in these cramped conditions and very much in each other's company. In other words, modern notions of privacy did not obtain. Everything that takes place in a family would have taken place in front of the entire family. If the family was lucky, it might have a second room to shelter the animals. Otherwise, during winter, you bring the animals in with you. Animals are so valuable, so necessary for survival, that you can't risk their death in a frost. They provide milk, cheese, wool that might keep this family solvent, even alive, during the hard times of winter. Finally, surrounding the village were the fields where the villagers worked. Let's talk a little bit about work. The work of early modern European people was, of course, dependent upon where they lived. In town, most people sold goods or services. Merchants acted as middlemen for grain, cattle, or wool. Craftsmen made and sold cloth, shoes, barrels, candles. They shoed horses if they were blacksmiths. They ground grain if they were millers. To do so, they had to belong to the local guild, which made sure that any merchant, any craftsman was a member. You couldn't trade outside the guild. They made goods by hand and on spec, rather than keeping a ready stock. You would go in, you'd order a pair of shoes. They lived above their shops with their families and apprentices who helped with the work. Port cities contained all the crafts and trades that we associate with seafaring: fishermen, shipwrights, carpenters, sailmakers, dock workers, customs officials. In upland areas or swamps, people made their livings with sheep farming or dairy farming. They spun wool, flax, or hemp. They engaged in quarrying. But most villagers depended upon arable farming. Surrounding the village would be a plot of common land. On this you could graze animals, and you could also play sports and games. Each villager's rented land would be arranged in long strips. in a haphazard manner. You might have several strips that didn't connect with each other. Now, you may be wondering, why strips? Why not the neat squares that we today see from airplanes when we look down on farms? Well, the idea behind the long strip was that it was easier to plow, because at the end of the Middle Ages, the standard beast of burden was an ox. Now, I have to admit, I don't have a lot of experience with oxen, but I am told that oxen are not easily turned around. So you don't want to be negotiating those four corners. You want to get behind that thing and plow all day in one direction. Men went out to the fields where they hoed and they plowed and they sowed and they pruned and they harvested and they winnowed. There, they were joined by women and children at peak times, planting in the spring and harvest in the fall. They worked sun up to sundown, which implied longer hours in summer, shorter but colder hours in winter. At other times, the women cooked and sewed clothes, fetched water, spun or wove wool, and again, these supplemental sources of income might be the difference between economic or even physical survival and poverty or death. Children looked after the animals, and when older, looked after younger children. By the way, this was a very common way for children to die, because animals can gore children. Accidents were very frequent. Before we leave these people, it's worth remembering that this manor and village would be their entire world. Most villagers never saw a city. They never touched the ocean. They never passed the borders of their county. Being such a small community, everyone will know everyone else and everyone else's business. Peer pressure must have been immense, and our modern notions of privacy would have been entirely foreign to these people. All would have been conscious of the fact that they were not masters of their own destinies. Well, who was? The landlord on the hill overlooking the village. He might live many miles away, actually, or he might be in a manor house from which he could view his peasants. But in any case, he was the person who determined their fates. The landlord might have been a great nobleman or a prosperous squire or a minor gentleman. He might have owned many manors across the country or just this one. He might have lived on the estate or at a great distance, but what is certain is that he had tremendous power over his tenants. First, he commanded a vast income. He owned nearly all the land in the neighborhood, and that land yielded an income from harvesting its crops, exploiting its mineral wealth, and above all, collecting the rents of the tenants who lived and worked on it. In addition, the landlord probably owned the best mill for the grinding of grain and the best oven for the baking of bread. So he's got you coming and going. You pay rent to grow grain on his land that you then have to pay him to grind and to bake. Control of the land also implied control of the church, since it's probable that the landlord names the priest and can also fire the priest from that local chapel. He could demand from his tenants not only rents, but taxes, which could be paid in produce, wheat, butter, a certain number of chickens a year. He had exclusive hunting and fishing rights. He could demand corvées, annual service of a few days a year for building roads and the upkeep of his estate. He could demand military service in time of war, and even by custom the sexual favors of any young woman on his land. If you know the plot of The Marriage of Figaro, you know that this is an important plot point. These rights were called the droit du seigneur, or seigneurial rights. Often, the king would ask him to use his power to maintain order in the countryside as a local official. Or paradoxically, that local importance might draw him to the capital to attend the king's council and court, or to sit in parliament, or the Estates General, or the Cortes. Now, given his immense power, it's probably fortunate that medieval theology argued that great landowners had a paternal responsibility to take care of their tenants. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture. But in the meantime, it should be obvious that being a landlord gave tremendous power. Now, if you remember one thing about Europe in 1500, it should be that the people who mattered in 1500, in 1700, and beyond owned land. By virtue of owning land, they owned all those little villages and all those little lives of the people who lived in them. The second thing you should remember is that the proportion of people who own land is very, very small, less than 10% of the population. The highest nobility, with sometimes 30% of the land, amounted to less than 0.5% of that population. All of which should raise a question. Why did the other 99.5% of the population put up with it? As my students like to ask me, why didn't they just rebel? As we shall see, sometimes they did, but by and large they did not. If they did not, it has something to do with the way they constructed their universe in their heads. To explain why they didn't rebel, I now have to talk about the great chain of being.